Let me begin by saying what a great pleasure and honor it is for me to join with you in celebrating these two extraordinary poets whose confluences, whose affiliations and differences are so illuminating. Hence my title, William Carlos Williams and Denise Levertov, A Dialogue About Poetics. William Carlos Williams and Denise Levertov met at a critical point in their poetic lives, and they both happily acknowledged its importance. For Williams, a confirmation; for Levertov, a clarification. Her first book of poems, The Double Image, published in England in 1946, brought her sufficient notice for Kenneth Rexroth to include 6 of her poems in his 1949 anthology, The New British Poets. But by that time, Levertov had married Mitchell Goodman, had moved to New York in 1948, and realized that she had to remake herself into an American poet in a very different cultural climate. Williams was, of course, the recognized master of the open form poem. But by the late 1940s, Williams was feeling isolated and depressed, incapacitated by a couple of debilitating strokes, and uncertain about his poetic future. Goodman's poet friend Robert Creeley gave Levertov Williams' address in Rutherford, and her first letter, insecurely introducing herself, brought an immediate and enthusiastic response. And their friendship and poetic exchange lasted until his death in 1963. Levertov had, in fact, encountered Williams' poems before she came to America, but she found that she didn't know how to read them. Now, however, he was nothing less than the revelation, that's her word, the revelation that she was looking for and needed. Williams, she said, is an important discovery. The style of his poems, their hard honesty, each one a core and not a vague aura. That is a revelation to me. It is the fact of his being so specifically American that gives his work even more value at present. To the end of her life, in essays and interviews, Levertov reiterated her indebtedness. Williams was a sort of gateway into my own development as a poet. He opened up a new way of handling language. For his part, the aging Williams was energized by his new young acolyte. I have never forgot how you came to me out of the formalism of English verse. In letters and visits, he eagerly gave her a quick course in the poetics of open form. What I'm going to read are excerpts from letters to her, the early letters to him. A matter of intensity, he said, a matter of intensity of the mood, a choice of diction that forces the pace, compels the words to obey until the reader is astonished by the words and the intensity of the words. Writing, good writing, is still a matter of compelling the words to obey. It's never easy. In another letter, the test of how a poet is going to divide her lines is the test of who she or he is. For her part, Levertov was a quick and skilled learner, and she could not have she could not have but been deeply pleased when, in a letter of June 14th, 1956, Williams commended her mastery of rhythmic structure, and he hailed her first American book with the Williams-esque title Here and Now, 1957, hailed it as done with the fewest possible words, with no straining after effect. The words are copied direct from vision seen, actually seen. In recommending Levertov for a Guggenheim Fellowship, Williams summed up his admiration. I haven't in years the conviction of energy and chained power that this woman gives me, perfectly disciplined. And he went on to predict that she would become one of the most distinguished artists of her time. Nevertheless, through all that they came to share in fundamental assumptions about poetic language and form, there was from the beginning a fundamental and distinguishing difference of poetic vision that became clearer as Levertov came into her own as a poet. Careful reading of poems by both poets illustrates and illuminates this difference. Williams described the genesis of his poem, The Great Figure, in his autobiography. On 15th Street in Lower Manhattan, I heard a great clatter of bells and the roar of a fire engine passing the end of the street down 9th Avenue. I turned just in time to see a golden figure 5 on a red background flash by. The impression was so sudden and forceful that I wrote a short poem about it. The poem focuses and fixes the sights and sounds of that moment into a moment of consciousness. The Great Figure. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, as wheels rumbling through the dark city. It is an Imagist poem, and Williams' painter friend Charles Demuth visualized the poem into an oil painting. Let's look at the painting and read the poem again. The Great Figure. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, as wheels rumbling through the dark city. Spring and All, 1923, is the breakthrough book that defined Williams' practice of open form. As he says in The Red Wheelbarrow, the most famous poem in Spring and All, so much depends upon the poem's realization of the immediacies of the here and now into awareness. The pivotal word depends means in its root hangs from. And Williams hangs the line at depends so that the rest of the dependent poem is impelled and sustained by that urgent directive. And nothing was too commonplace for the focus of Williams' verbal seeing. A red wheelbarrow in the rain beside chickens, a lotus tree in blossom, the taste of cold plums from the refrigerator, an old jaundiced woman licking her sore lips, the crowd at a baseball game, yachts jockeying to start a race, a pot of flowers in the lamplight. The Pot of Flowers is the second poem in Spring and All and it stands as an exemplum of his poetics. In this case, the painting came first. Williams was working from Demuth's watercolor tube roses, which he owned. The pot of flowers. Pink confused with white flowers and flowers reversed. Take and spill the shaded flame, darting it back into the lamp's form. Petals aslant, darkened with mauve. Red, where in whirls petal lays its glow upon petal, round flame green throats. Petals radiant with transpiercing light, contending above the leaves, reaching up their modest green from the pot's rim. And there, wholly dark, the pot, gay with rough moss. The carefully lineated interplay of light and dark, the repetition of flowers and petals with different shades of color, constitutes seeing as saying, and saying as seeing. So much depends upon it. A comparable poem by Levertov, for all its similarities to the pot of flowers, reveals the different character and intention between Williams' way of seeing and hers. The Ripple, from her 1964 volume, O Taste and See, simply describes a water jug and glasses in light and shadow. The Ripple. On white linen, the silk of gray shadows, threefold, overlapping, a tau cross. Glass jug and tumblers rise from that which they cast. And luminous in each overcast of cylindrical shade, image of water, a brightness, not gold, not silver, rippling as if with laughter. Levertov says here what she sees with delicate precision. However, what she focuses on is not the solidity of jug and tumblers, but the shimmering of light in shadow. What she sees has an aura, an overlapping, overcasting intimation of a mystery inherent but unseen, intuited and glimpsed. The triple shadows of the jug and tumblers form, to her surprise almost, a tau cross. What fascinates her eye and teases her imagination is not the water in the jug and tumblers, but the image. The word is isolated in a line of its own, the image of water, luminous in the shadowy cross. This intimation of a further dimension moves her words from sensory description to metaphor. The shimmering brightness is not gold, not silver, but ripples, as if with laughter. Let's now read the poem through again, slowly. The Ripple. On white linen, the silk of gray shadows, threefold, overlapping, a tau cross. Glass jug and tumblers rise from that which they cast, and luminous in each overcast of cylindrical shade, image of water, a brightness, not gold, not silver, rippling as if with laughter. Looking back in 1984, Levertov could recognize that, these are her words, that her acknowledgement and celebration of mystery probably constitutes the most consistent theme of my poetry. Early on in her exchange with Williams, as she was sending him poems for criticism, he began to detect a difference in what their poems were saying and doing. He was at once intrigued, but also puzzled and uncomprehending. This is from a letter of January 6th, 1954. Somehow this last poem seems to me to come from a hidden part of your unconscious that has a particular attraction to me. It is as if a presence had passed, touching the miscellaneous objects and persons that make up your composition, with nothing of which it has to do. You have brushed the raiments of an unknown host in these lines. And on August 23rd, 1954, there is something indescribably appealing to me in what you write. I'd like to be able to indicate more clearly what it is, but so far it has escaped collaring. It is a problem that eludes me. By the time of her 1959 collection, With Eyes at the Back of Our Heads, he began to wonder if her sensibility had a spiritual or religious cast or source. I'm going to read these first half dozen poems and more until, as an old man, I penetrate to where your secret is hid. It may be Druidic, or perhaps a Hebraic recrudescence. It may at any time be lost. See that it isn't at any cost! Exclamation point. Williams would have known from Levertov herself about her Druidic and Hebraic affiliations. Her beloved father, Paul Levertov, who had just died in 1954, was a Russian Hasidic Jew who had converted to Christianity. After marrying her Welsh mother and settling in England, Paul Levertov had become an Anglican priest with a parish in East London. And throughout his long life, he was a respected scholar in Jewish-Christian dialogue. And on her mother's side, Levertov's Welsh forebears had a couple of famous seers. The title, O Taste and See, is taken from Psalm 34, and the title poem in that volume declares that savoring the immediate moment in all its sensory fullness is the source of vision. Taste and see. In The Garden Wall, another poem in that volume, the imagination discovers a double vision, recalling her first book, The Double Image. The poem describes how the ordinary brown bricks in a garden wall are transformed by a spray from the hose to reveal a hazy red, a grain gold, a mauve of small shadows sprung from the quiet, dry brown. Archetype of the world, always a step beyond the world that can't be looked for only as the eye wanders, found. Levertov consistently and devotedly pointed to Williams as, quote again, the primary influence on my development. precisely for teaching her the essential formal concerns of diction and line and structure. Moreover, she argued vigorously against any reductive reading of Williams' poems as mere visual notations without content. He had proposed the dictum, no ideas but in things, but she said there are many more ideas in his things than he's commonly credited with. She wrote an essay called The Ideas in the Things. And in the essay, she illustrates her point by explicating in detail two of Williams' poems, The Farmer and A Morning Imagination of Russia. Here is The Farmer, which comes just after The Pot of Flowers in Spring and All. The Farmer. The farmer in deep thought is pacing through the rain among his blank fields with hands in pockets. In his head, the harvest already planted. A cold wind ruffles the water among the browned weeds. On all sides, the world rolls coldly away. Black orchards, darkened by the March clouds, leaving room for thought. Down past the brushwood, bristling by the rain-sluiced wagon road, looms the artist figure of the farmer, composing, antagonist. The poet as farmer, the farmer as poet, confronting a wintry, disordered world, and composing amidst it, from it, a poem, a harvest. The word antagonist stands alone in the closing line to constellate the images into a poem. The prose passages surrounding and situating the poems in Spring and All define the function and intention of the poet antagonist. I am not in search of the beautiful illusion, Williams writes. I am not in search of the beautiful illusion, to refine, to clarify, to intensify that eternal moment in which alone we live, is but a single force, the imagination. Yes, the imagination has destroyed and recreated everything afresh in the likeness of what it was. The value of the imagination consists in its ability to make words. With all this in mind, let's read The Farmer again. The farmer in deep thought is pacing through the rain among his blank fields with hands in pockets. In his head, the harvest already planted. A cold wind ruffles the waters. A cold wind ruffles the water among the browned weeds. On all sides, the world rolls coldly away. Black orchards, darkened by the March clouds, leaving room for thought. Down past the brushwood, bristling by the rain-sluiced wagon road, looms the artist figure of the farmer, composing, antagonist. Levertov's admiration for Williams did not keep her from recognizing that he stood, and this is her phrase, that he stood for an objective anti-metaphysical aesthetic. And what she missed in such poems, she said, was an impulse of spiritual quest. Levertov, however, had other mentors besides Williams. She'd been reading Rainer Maria Rilke in translation even before she came to America, starting with a gift volume from her father in 1942. And her 1981 essay, Rilke as Mentor, delineates her return to his writings throughout her poetic life. What he gave her, she wrote, was an influence not on style, not on technique, but rather a conviction of the exalted and moral nature of the poet's vocation, intent not just on seeing, but on what Rilke called in-seeing. And more immediately among her contemporaries, Levertov found a soulmate in Robert Duncan, the San Francisco poet who was a friend of Creeley, and like Creeley was associated with what came to be called the Black Mountain School of Poets. Duncan contacted Levertov in 1955 after reading one of her poems in the journal Origin, and that gesture initiated a friendship and an intense correspondence over the next 2 decades. They exchanged poems, they wrote poems for one another, they wrote poems about each other. And their ongoing conversation back and forth is impelled by their shared sense of poetic vocation, their commitment to the visionary imagination, as in Duncan's phrase, an opening of the field to sight and insight. After Duncan's death, Levertov reflected on their association in a wonderful essay called Some Duncan Letters, a memoir and a critical tribute. And their published correspondence runs over 700 pages. But throughout the 1950s, through her correspondence with Williams and Duncan, Levertov increasingly felt the need to respond to these various influences by articulating her own poetics. Some Notes on Organic Form was published in 1965, but had been gestating in lectures and notebooks for several years. Not just open form then, but organic form. Williams had given his most provocative statement of his poetics in the introduction to The Wedge, 1944. And there he wrote, "Let the metaphysical take care of itself. The art has nothing to do with it. A poem is a small or large machine made of words. It isn't what the poet says that counts as a work of art. It's what he makes. The poem as machine is the antithesis of the poem as organism." The Black Mountain poets constellated around Creeley's dictum that form is never more than an extension of content. But in her essay, Levertov revises that dictum radically to read, "Form is never more than a revelation of content." The italics on revelation, stressing the distinction she's insisting upon. Some Notes begins by citing Jared Manley Hopkins' notions of inscape and in-stress as associated with the poetry, and these are Levertov's words, the poetry seeking out inherent, though not immediately apparent, form. Then Levertov gives a remarkably succinct and evocative description of the generative process of organic poetry. A partial definition, then, of organic poetry, she writes, might be that it is a method of apperception, that is, of recognizing what we perceive, and is based on an order, a form beyond forms, in which forms partake, and of which man's creative works are analogies, resemblances, natural allegories. The poet, she says, is brought to speech, in italics, is brought to speech by the generative experience that demands a poem, so that the creative process begins in contemplation, meditation. To contemplate comes from templum, temple, a place, a space for observation, marked out by the augur. It means not simply to observe, to regard, but to do these things in the presence of a God, small g, God. And to meditate is to keep the mind in a state of contemplation. Its synonym is to muse. And to muse comes from a word meaning to stand with open mouth. Not so comical if we think of inspiration, to breathe in. One wonders what Williams would have made of these sentences, but they did spell out the hidden and secret dimension of Levertov's poems that had baffled and intrigued him. The rest of Levertov's essay discusses more clearly and directly than Williams managed in his own essays, the hands-on crafting of the poem, diction, spacing, movement, measure. But for Levertov, the poem as verbal organism is both formed and informed. Not surprisingly, this sacramental sense of experience already informing the poems of the 50s and 60s became more pronounced over the years. And in the 1984 essay, A Poet's View, she traces that evolution. The unknown, she writes, the unknown began to be defined for me as God, now capital G, God, and further as God revealed in the incarnation, capital I, incarnation. Increasingly from the 70s on through the 90s, Levertov wrote some of the most memorable religious and then specifically Christian poetry of the 20th century. Moreover, the incarnational mystery only deepened her awed sense of the physical world. In Passage, wind blowing through the grasses of a spring meadow is experienced as the ruach, the sustaining breath of God. Spiritus in Latin means breath and wind and spirit. Listen then in these uncharacteristically long lines to the transforming wordplay on pass and grass, and to the sweep of sibilance, verbalizing the wind's passage. Passage. The spirit that walked upon the face of the waters walks the meadow of long grass. Green shines to silver as the spirit passes. Wind from the compass points, sun at meridian. These are the forms the spirit enters. Breath, ruach, light that is witness and by which we witness. The grasses numberless, bowing and rising, silently cry Hosanna as the Spirit moves them and moves, burnishing over and again upon mountain pastures. A day of spring, a needle's eye, space and time are passing through like a swath of silk. Wind, breath, spirit, the breath of spring, the breath of God, the breath of the poem. Let's read it again, slowly. Passage. The spirit that walked upon the face of the waters walks the meadow of long grass. Green shines to silver as the spirit passes. Wind from the compass points, sun at meridian. These are the forms the spirit enters. Breath, ruach, light that is witness and by which we witness. The grasses numberless, bowing and rising, silently cry Hosanna as the Spirit moves them and moves, burnishing over and again upon mountain pastures. A day of spring, a needle's eye, space and time are passing through like a swath of silk. For Williams, as we've heard, the imagination was a constructive faculty, composing the transient moment into conscious awareness. Levertov continued to explicate crafting the poem in a number of essays, including several about Williams and even a poem called Williams, an Essay. Moreover, unlike many of Williams' critics and admirers, Levertov liked the late, longer poems that Williams began to write after Patterson, organized in tercets with what he called the variable foot. Her positive response is not surprising since those poems were more personal, more introspective and reflective than Williams' earlier poems. She saw them as a great final flowering. And she wrote an essay on the variable foot and experimented with that metrical form in several of her own poems. But as we have seen, for her, the imagination had a visionary dimension, concentrating on, and this is her phrase, concentrating on not just the appearance of phenomena, but the presence of spirit within those phenomena. The last poem in her collected poems, perhaps the last poem that Levertov wrote, is called Aware. And one imagines that Williams would once again have delighted in that secret dimension of her consciousness that so puzzled and eluded him. Aware. When I opened the door, I found the vine leaves speaking among themselves in abundant whispers. My presence made them hush their green breath, embarrassed, the way humans stand up, buttoning their jackets, acting as if they were leaving anyway, as if the conversation had ended just before you arrived. I liked the glimpse I had, though, of their obscure gestures. I liked the sound of such private voices. Next time, I'll move like cautious sunlight, open the door by fractions, eavesdrop, peacefully. No antagonist poet confronting an alien world here. In the poem, through the poem, the poet opens herself with reverent care to the whispering life outside, for whatever it might reveal. Thank you again for the invitation to participate in this conference. I wish I could be with you there in Madrid. Thanks also to Lara Holbling for recording this lecture. Lara is a distinguished translator of books into Croatian, and she's the wife of my old student and friend Ivan Matkovic, now retired from the University of Zagreb. Barbara and I Zoom regularly with them in Zagreb. And when Laura realized my technological anxiety about recording this lecture myself, she came to my rescue and is now recording me in California on her computer in Zagreb. And here I am, so bless you. But let me conclude with a special greeting to three friends there in the audience in Madrid who spoke earlier in this conference: José Rodríguez, Cristina Gámez, and Ann Dewey. I've known Ann since she was a graduate student at Stanford, and even then, she was working with the Levertov poems and papers and manuscripts that Denise had deposited in the Stanford Library. And Anne went on then to be the co-editor of Denise's collected poems. I first met Jose and then Cristina when they came at different times to consult the Levertov archive at Stanford. And that engagement with Levertov has flowered in their own work and publications. So hello and a big hug to them from Barbara and me. And so thank you all.